My sister slapped my baby at our Christmas dinner, and my mother had the nerve to tell me I was overreacting. The entire dining room went dead silent. Then my military commander husband stood up, looking straight into my sister's eyes with a coldness that could freeze hell itself. He said 2 words, "Leave now." My arrogant white brother-in-law laughed and claimed they owned our house. They had no idea I was quietly sitting on a $40 million tech fortune or that I was about to systematically destroy their perfect little high society lives. If you have ever had to protect your peace from toxic family members, hit that like button and subscribe, because karma has never looked this good. The heavy crystal stemware shattered against the living room hardwood floor with a deafening crash. My terrible nephew had been running around the dining table for 20 minutes completely unchecked by his parents. The sharp noise startled my 1-year-old son Leo, who immediately burst into terrified tears. I reached down to scoop him out of his high chair, but my sister Chloe was faster. She leaned across the table, her designer bracelets clanking together, and slapped my baby right across his hand. "Shut up, you little brat!" She fiercely snapped, her voice echoing through the sudden silence of the room. I stood frozen for exactly 1 second. My brain could not process what had just happened. My sister, a former Spelman pageant queen, who prided herself on her flawless public image, had just physically struck my infant son in my own home. "Get your hands off my child!" I yelled, pulling Leo to my chest. He was wailing now, his tiny face red and wet with tears. I glared at Chloe, feeling a surge of protective rage that made my hands shake. "What exactly is wrong with you?" My mother Evelyn casually took a sip of her Chardonnay and rolled her eyes. "You are overreacting, Maya," she said, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Chloe just tapped him to teach him some manners. Lord knows somebody needs to do it since you spoil him so much." I stared at my mother, completely appalled. "She hit him," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "He is a baby." He was terrified by the loud glass breaking. Evelyn scoffed, cutting a piece of turkey. "Oh, please. I used to pop you on the hand and mouth all the time when you were a stubborn teenager acting out. You turned out fine. You need to stop being so sensitive. You have always been too emotional, always playing the victim." That was her favorite narrative. Growing up in Atlanta, I was the dark-skinned, quiet daughter who liked computers, while Chloe was the light-skinned golden child who brought home trophies and wealthy boyfriends. When my parents cut off my college tuition to buy Chloe a sports car for her graduation, I had to work 3 jobs to pay my way through school. When I suffered a breakdown from the stress, my mother called it a dramatic phase. Now she was sitting at my dining table justifying physical abuse against my child under the guise of teaching manners. Before I could unleash the decades of resentment bubbling in my throat, the chair beside me scraped loudly against the floor. My husband David stood up. David is a Navy lieutenant commander. He is a man of few words, but when he speaks, people listen. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as he walked slowly around the table. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He stopped right behind Chloe's chair and stared down at her. "Leave," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now." Chloe looked up at him, her smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second before she turned to her husband Preston. Preston, a wealthy white hedge fund manager who always viewed my family as his personal charity case, let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch. "Look, pal, I know you like giving orders to your little sailors, but you do not talk to my wife that way," Preston said, a condescending smirk on his face. "Besides, you cannot kick us out of this house. We all know my in-laws co-signed the mortgage for you guys. You could never afford this place on your little military government salary, so technically we have just as much right to be here as you do." David did not blink. He simply pointed toward the front door, his jaw set in stone. "I will not say it again," he warned. "Get out of my house before I physically remove you." Preston stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to use his height and white privilege to intimidate a decorated military officer. It was a laughable attempt. Evelyn slammed her hands on the table, commanding everyone to sit down and act like a respectable family, but the damage was done. Chloe grabbed her designer coat off the chair, wrapping it around herself with a theatrical sigh. She looked at me with pure venom in her eyes. "Fine," she spat. "We will leave. But enjoy this house tonight, Maya. Savor every minute of it, because the bank is foreclosing on this property tomorrow morning anyway." I stopped bouncing Leo and stared at her. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice dropping. Chloe smirked, her perfectly painted lips twisting into a cruel smile. "Preston needed some bridge capital for his fund last month, so Dad used this house as collateral," she said, breezing toward the doorway. "Thanks for signing as our guarantor, by the way." I froze completely. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had never signed a single legal document for Preston or my father in my entire life. I knew instantly that my parents had committed a massive fraud to steal my home and future. The sun had not even peeked over the Atlanta skyline, but I was already wide awake and staring at my dual monitors. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford when my own family was actively trying to destroy my life. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I logged into the county clerk online portal. I needed to see exactly what Chloe meant about the bank foreclosing on my house. My stomach churned with a sickening mixture of dread and adrenaline. I pulled up the property records for my address and downloaded the most recent filings. There it was, in black and white. A commercial deed of trust securing a $2.5 million loan. The borrower was listed as Apex Heritage, which I knew was Preston's failing hedge fund. The guarantor offering up my home as collateral was me. I zoomed in on the signature page and felt the air leave my lungs. Someone had perfectly replicated my signature, but the slight hesitation on the letter M gave it away. The notary stamp belonged to a man named Thomas Vance, who happened to be my father, Marcus' longtime golfing buddy. My own father had forged my signature to leverage my home to save his arrogant white son-in-law. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering. I printed the forged documents, shoved them into my tote bag, and grabbed my keys. David was already awake, preparing for his run. He saw my face and offered to come, but I shook my head. This was a battle I needed to fight myself. I drove across town to my parents' sprawling estate in Buckhead. I did not bother knocking. I used the keypad code and marched straight into their formal dining room. My father Marcus was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, casually reading the Wall Street Journal and sipping a perfectly frothed cappuccino. He looked up, seemingly unfazed by my sudden intrusion. I slammed the stack of forged property documents directly onto the financial section of his newspaper. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Explain how my signature ended up on a $2.5 million commercial loan for Preston's failing hedge fund." Marcus slowly folded his newspaper and let out a long, exasperated sigh. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed that I was interrupting his breakfast. "You are always so dramatic, Maya," he said, picking up his coffee cup. "Preston is a financial genius who is simply going through a temporary rough patch in the market. He needed bridge capital to secure a massive real estate deal. The banks were being difficult, so we had to get creative. We are family. Families help each other." I stared at him, feeling a cold knot form in my chest. "You committed federal wire fraud and forged my name to steal my house. That is not getting creative. That is a felony." My mother Evelyn strolled into the dining room, wearing a silk robe, and immediately rushed to my father's defense. "Do not speak to your father that way," she scolded, crossing her arms. "We did what we had to do to protect Chloe's future. Preston is doing big things. You just make those little education apps on your computer. You do not understand high-level finance. You should be honored that your house is serving a greater purpose. Besides, you owe this family for paying for your expensive college education." The utter delusion in her voice was the final straw. "You gave me nothing." I fired back, gripping the edge of the table. "You cut off my tuition during my sophomore year because Chloe wanted a brand new Range Rover for her graduation present. I had to work the night shift at a diner, tutor freshmen in calculus, and scrub dorm room toilets just to keep from being expelled. You did not pay for my education. I built my life with my own two hands while you handed Chloe everything on a silver platter." Marcus slammed his hand flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. Enough, he barked. You will show some respect. Preston is going to triple that money by next month and pay the loan off. Until then, you and David need to stop making a fuss. The bank will not actually kick you out if you just cooperate. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me and realized he had never seen me as a daughter. He only saw me as an asset he could exploit to maintain his proximity to Preston's wealth and whiteness. You are delusional if you think I'm going to lose my home for that scammer, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I am going to the police. I am reporting the forgery and having Thomas Vance stripped of his notary license. Marcus let out a cold, harsh laugh. Go ahead, he mocked, leaning back in his chair. Who do you think the police will believe? A respected businessman with a clean record or an emotional app developer throwing a tantrum? We have the paperwork. We have the notary. You have nothing but a bad attitude. Get out of my house, Maya, and do not come back until you are ready to apologize to your sister. I did not scream or cry. I simply turned around and walked out the front door of their magnificent mansion. As I unlocked my car, my cell phone buzzed loudly in my jacket pocket. It was a text message from Preston. I opened it to find a picture of a massive moving truck parked directly outside my home. The caption read, "Just giving you a head start on packing." They thought they had cornered me. They did not know my education app was acquired for $45 million last year. I dialed my private wealth manager. Buy all Preston's debt right now, I commanded. The line rang twice before my asset manager picked up. Arthur was a ruthless financial strategist who handled my portfolio. He assumed I was calling for our scheduled quarterly review. But my voice was sharp and urgent with my demands. I needed him to execute a hostile debt acquisition immediately. Preston thought he was dealing with a struggling app developer. He thought I scraped by on a strict military budget. He was absolutely dead wrong about my entire financial situation. 3 years ago, I built a massive educational technology platform. It was designed to help underprivileged youth access advanced tutoring. The program scaled globally within 18 short and profitable months. Last year, a major tech conglomerate acquired my growing startup. They paid exactly $45 million in pure cash. I did not buy a mansion or flash designer bags. I quietly placed every single penny into a blind trust. I operated under an anonymous holding company called Vanguard Holdings. My parents and my sister never bothered asking about work. They had no idea I possessed such massive liquid capital. I held more wealth than Preston's entire failing hedge fund. Arthur listened silently as I explained the massive property forgery. I detailed the commercial loan my father had fraudulently secured. He used my property as collateral without my legal consent. I sent Arthur digital copies of the forged property deed. I included the loan origination documents pulled from the county. The lender was a vulnerable mid-sized regional commercial bank. Preston had likely sweet-talked them into extending risky credit. I did not want to just stop the illegal foreclosure. I wanted to permanently own the people destroying my family. I instructed Arthur to contact the bank's commercial lending division. I told him to purchase Preston's debt outright and completely. I authorized him to offer a 10% purchase premium. This would ensure the transaction closed immediately without any delays. Arthur warned me it was a highly aggressive financial maneuver. But he understood the tactical assignment perfectly without any hesitation. He promised to have the massive wire transfer completed fast. The assignment of debt would be finalized by early afternoon. I ended the call and walked slowly into my kitchen. I poured myself a tall glass of freezing cold water. My hands were finally perfectly steady after the morning chaos. The initial shock of my father's betrayal had completely evaporated. It left behind a cold and incredibly ruthless, calculating clarity. David walked in from his rigorous morning military fitness run. His gray training shirt was completely soaked with heavy sweat. He took one look at my face and knew instantly. He knew the family situation had escalated into active warfare. I told him everything about the terrible morning property discovery. I explained the forged signature on the commercial loan documents. I showed him the gloating text message from arrogant Preston. He sent a picture of the moving trucks arriving outside. David did not panic or shout about the sudden threat. His advanced military leadership training kicked in instantly and smoothly. He pulled a clean towel tightly around his muscular neck. He calmly asked what our exact next tactical move was. I smiled warmly while taking another sip of my water. I told him I had just bought Preston's commercial debt. By 3 this afternoon, we would fully legally own him. David let out a low whistle, shaking his handsome head. He smiled in quiet amusement at my aggressive financial retaliation. He always knew about my massive secret tech company sale. He fully supported my decision, keeping the money completely hidden. He walked over and kissed my forehead with deep affection. He told me he would contact his military legal team. The Judge Advocate General office would prepare for the fallout. We needed to be ready for whatever aggressive maneuvers occurred. My father and Preston might attempt retaliation once they realized. They would soon learn they no longer controlled the narrative. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound gratitude for David. He never felt threatened by my financial success or independence. We operated as a unified front against a toxic family. They spent my entire life trying to tear me down. The anxious morning hours ticked by with truly agonizing slowness. I paced the living room watching Leo play with blocks. He happily sat on the colorful rug stacking wooden squares. Every time my phone screen lit up, my heart skipped. Finally, at exactly 2:45, Arthur quickly called back. The massive financial transaction was now completely and fully executed. The regional bank had gladly offloaded the high-risk loan. Vanguard Holdings now possessed the entire portfolio of corporate debt. The digital paperwork had been signed, sealed, and officially filed. I was officially Preston's largest and most powerful secured creditor. If he missed a single payment, I had total authority. I could legally seize his assets and freeze his accounts. I could completely liquidate his corrupt and failing hedge fund. He tried stealing my house to save his sinking ship. Instead, he essentially handed me the keys to his life. I drafted a highly formal email from my corporate account. I informed him his commercial debt was successfully acquired today. A full audit of his financial ledgers was immediately required. I did not reveal my true identity in the message. I wanted him to sweat and feel sheer absolute terror. I wanted him to feel the exact same profound fear. He threatened to throw my innocent child into the street. I pressed send, watching it shoot across my computer screen. The feeling of absolute supreme power was truly wildly intoxicating. Today, the family dynamic permanently and entirely shifted forever now. Suddenly, a thunderous, aggressive pounding violently echoed through our house. 2 stern-faced individuals wearing official lanyards stood outside waiting. The woman flashed a silver badge with zero polite warmth. "We are Child Protective Services responding to an urgent tip. The caller claimed your husband is violently abusing your baby." David did not flinch when the agents pushed their way into our foyer. His military training equipped him to handle high-stress situations with chilling precision. The male agent immediately demanded to inspect our 1-year-old son, while the female agent pulled out a thick clipboard. They explained that an anonymous caller reported hearing glass shatter followed by a baby screaming and a man making violent threats. The description was a perfectly twisted weaponization of the truth. Chloe and Evelyn had orchestrated this ambush to destroy my husband's pristine military career. A formal abuse investigation would immediately suspend David's top-secret security clearance and completely derail his upcoming promotion. I felt a knot of panic tighten in my chest, but David simply crossed his arms and offered a polite smile. He calmly directed the agents to our pristine living room and asked them to have a seat. He did not argue or act defensive. Instead, he pulled out his phone and accessed his military personnel file. He handed the female agent his most recent psychological evaluation, which had been conducted less than 30 days ago. It documented his impeccable mental stability and outstanding character. The agent scanned the official military seals, and her aggressive posture noticeably softened. Then David delivered the absolute killing blow to my family's malicious narrative. He walked over to the digital control panel mounted on our wall and pulled up our interior security feed. My husband is a military tactician who insists on high-definition surveillance covering every inch of our main living areas. He rewound the footage to the exact moment of the Christmas dinner confrontation. The agents watched in stunned silence as the high-resolution video played. They saw the glass break. They saw little Leo cry. Then they watched in crystal-clear detail as my sister Chloe viciously slapped my baby across the hand. They heard my mother's cruel dismissal. They heard David's calm but firm command for them to leave. The anonymous tip was completely exposed as a vindictive lie. The male agent closed his notebook with a heavy sigh. He apologized profusely for the intrusion and explained the severe legal consequences for filing false child abuse reports. They promised to forward the incident to local law enforcement for a potential malicious reporting investigation against Chloe and my mother. I watched them walk down the driveway, feeling a profound sense of vindication. My family had tried to use the state against us and completely failed. I locked the massive front door behind them and finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. My hands were trembling from the pure adrenaline rushing through my veins. David went upstairs to check on Leo, leaving me alone with the security system monitor. I decided to export the video file to a secure cloud drive to ensure the footage was permanently safe. While the video processed, I casually scrubbed through the rest of the Christmas party recordings. I wanted to see what else my toxic family had been doing while I was busy hosting. I switched the camera feed to the hallway outside my private home office. I had explicitly locked that door before the guests arrived. My blood ran completely cold as I watched the screen. The footage showed my mother Evelyn creeping down the hallway looking over her shoulder like a common thief. She pulled a small silver key from her designer purse. I instantly recognized it as the spare key I kept hidden inside a fake potted plant in the guest bathroom. She unlocked my office door and slipped inside for exactly 4 minutes. When she emerged, she was frantically shoving something into her oversized tote bag. I enhanced the video resolution and zoomed in on her hands. She was holding a vintage mahogany lockbox with distinctive brass corners. It belonged to my late grandmother. My grandmother was the only person in my family who truly loved and protected me. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left that specific lockbox entirely to my care. She told me it contained absolute proof of her true final wishes. Evelyn had always despised my grandmother for favoring me over her precious golden child Chloe. I sprinted down the hallway and threw open my office door. I tore through my lower desk drawers, tossing files and supplies onto the carpet. The secret compartment at the very back was completely empty. My mother had robbed me blind during a holiday dinner. I did not waste time calling Evelyn to demand an explanation. Liars only lie more when confronted directly. I reached into my desk and grabbed my spare tablet. 3 months ago, my mother demanded I buy her a new luxury vehicle because her old car was embarrassing her at the country club. I refused to pay for the vehicle, but David ended up helping my father handle the dealership paperwork. David had quietly slipped a magnetic tracking device deep into the undercarriage of Evelyn's car. He insisted on it for security purposes, knowing my family had a habit of showing up uninvited. He always suspected they would try to steal from us eventually. The tracker synced directly to a secure private application on my tablet. I opened the tracking application and watched the blinking red dot representing my mother's location. She was not at her massive Buckhead estate or her elite country club. The hidden digital tracker showed her securely parked outside a dilapidated commercial strip mall on the absolute worst side of downtown Atlanta. I pulled up the exact address on a search engine and felt a surge of pure adrenaline. The building housed the office of a disbarred and highly corrupt real estate lawyer named Arthur Vance. He was the brother of the exact same notary who had fraudulently signed my house over to Preston. My treacherous mother was not just stealing our priceless family heirlooms. She was actively heading into a filthy criminal den to illegally and permanently alter my grandmother's true will. I pushed my vehicle to its absolute mechanical limits, tearing down the interstate toward the decaying industrial underbelly of the city. My knuckles were completely white as I gripped the steering wheel, navigating through the heavy Atlanta traffic. The sheer magnitude of my mother's betrayal burned through my veins like liquid fire. She had not only stood by while my father forged my signature to steal my house, but she had actively orchestrated a fake child abuse hotline call to ruin my husband. Now she was physically stealing the last remaining piece of my beloved grandmother. I pulled into the cracked, pothole-riddled parking lot of the desolate strip mall. My mother's pristine white luxury SUV sat parked haphazardly across two spaces, looking completely absurd against the backdrop of pawn shops and abandoned storefronts. I threw my car into park and marched toward the grimy glass door bearing the peeling gold foil letters of Arthur Vance. I did not bother turning the handle gently. I shoved the heavy glass door open, with enough force to slam it violently against the interior wall. The dingy office smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. Behind a cluttered laminate desk sat Arthur Vance, a greasy man with thinning hair and a cheap suit. He was hovering eagerly over my grandmother's vintage mahogany lockbox, with a heavy metal pry bar in his hand. Standing right beside him, clutching her designer pearls, was my mother. She jumped backward, bumping into a filing cabinet as I stormed into the cramped room. "Get your filthy hands off my property!" I demanded, my voice cold and echoing in the small space. Evelyn quickly recovered her composure, pasting on a mask of indignant authority. "You have absolutely no right to follow me, Maya," she snapped, straightening her silk blouse. "This box is family property. Your grandmother was losing her mind at the end of her life. Arthur is simply helping me secure the family assets before you do something completely irresponsible." I walked directly up to the desk and snatched the pry bar out of Arthur's hand, tossing it onto the floor with a loud metallic clatter. I looked the disgraced lawyer dead in the eyes. "If you touch that box again, I will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary sharing a cell with your brother Thomas. I know all about the fraudulent notary stamp he provided for my father this morning." Arthur visibly swallowed hard and took a massive step backward, raising his hands in surrender. He wanted easy money, not a federal wire fraud indictment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, ornate brass key I had worn on a chain around my neck for 2 entire years. My grandmother had pressed it into my palm during her final days in the hospital. She warned me that Evelyn and Marcus would try to strip my bones clean if I did not protect myself. I inserted the key into the vintage lock and turned it. The heavy brass mechanism clicked loudly in the silent room. I opened the mahogany lid and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents sealed with an official state watermark. I unfolded the heavy parchment and began reading the actual unaltered contents of my grandmother's true last will and testament. The words on the page completely realigned my entire understanding of my family's financial history. My grandmother did not just leave me a box of sentimental jewelry. She had officially bypassed her own greedy daughter and left her entire commercial real estate empire directly to me. It was a massive multi-acre portfolio of prime commercial development land located right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The documents clearly stated that she knew Marcus and Evelyn were financial vultures who would squander the family legacy on their own arrogant vanity. She legally transferred the sole ownership of the deed to my name, ensuring they could never touch a single dime of its generational wealth. I looked up from the papers and stared at my mother with absolute profound disgust. "You hid this from me," I stated, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "For 2 entire years, you buried my grandmother's final wishes. You sat at my dining room table and told me I was a financial burden while you were actively hoarding a multi-million-dollar commercial estate that legally belonged to me." Evelyn did not even possess the basic human decency to look ashamed. Her perfectly painted lips twisted into a cruel, ugly sneer. She crossed her arms, defensive and fiercely entitled. "Your grandmother was crazy," she shouted, her voice shrill and echoing in the dingy office. She was a bitter old woman who did not understand modern business. "That property belongs to Preston. It is the exact location he needs to build his new luxury corporate tower. He is a visionary. He is going to elevate our family name into the highest social circles in this city. You would have just wasted that land building community centers or whatever pathetic charity projects you pretend to care about. I am the matriarch of this family, and I decide who deserves that wealth." She stepped forward, reaching aggressively for the legal documents in my hands. Give me those papers, Maya. Arthur is going to draft an addendum proving she was not of sound mind. You are going to sign it right now and hand that land over to your brother-in-law. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply looked at the woman who had spent my entire 33 years making me feel completely worthless. She was nothing but a hollow, desperate shell terrified of losing her country club status. I carefully folded my grandmother's true will and placed it safely inside my leather jacket. I smiled a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that made Evelyn physically freeze in her tracks. Preston cannot build anything, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, because I just ordered the immediate demolition of his current leased office for severe non-payment. Remember, Evelyn, I bought his debt. Preston Thornton III pulled his sleek silver Porsche into the underground VIP parking garage of the downtown commercial high-rise. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a smug expression. He was completely oblivious to the financial earthquake that had already triggered. In his mind, he was an untouchable titan of industry who had just successfully secured his failing hedge fund using my stolen property. He grabbed his artisanal imported espresso and confidently strode into the private executive elevator. He pressed the button for the penthouse floor, expecting to walk into his luxurious suite and bark orders at his terrified interns. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime. Preston stepped forward but instantly collided with a thick, heavy iron chain. His espresso sloshed over the rim, burning his knuckles as he stumbled backward. The elegant frosted glass doors bearing the Apex Heritage logo were completely wrapped in heavy industrial chains and secured with a massive brass padlock. Smeared across the pristine glass were 4 neon green legal notices. The bold black letters screamed the words immediate eviction and total asset seizure. Preston dropped his coffee cup. The ceramic shattered against the marble floor, mimicking the sudden destruction of his entire reality. He frantically grabbed the heavy chains, rattling them with aggressive desperation. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. The service elevator down the hall pinged and the building manager stepped out. Mr. Sterling was a towering, no-nonsense man who had zero patience for arrogant tenants. He was flanked by 2 burly armed private security guards. "Step away from the doors," Mr. Thornton, the manager, ordered, his tone completely flat and devoid of any respect. Preston immediately puffed out his chest, attempting to wield his white privilege like a weapon. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "I lease this entire floor. I will have your job for this, Sterling. I am calling my father-in-law right now, and we are going to sue this building into absolute oblivion. Open these doors immediately." Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He calmly pulled a clipboard from under his arm. "You do not lease anything anymore, Mr. Thornton. Your holding company defaulted on its primary commercial loans. The new debt owner executed a hostile takeover this morning and demanded an immediate lockout. You have zero legal rights to this property. Your firm is completely insolvent." Preston lunged forward, trying to aggressively shoulder his way past the manager. "This is a mistake. I just secured $2.5 million in fresh collateral today. My father-in-law, Marcus, guaranteed it." The 2 armed guards instantly stepped in front of Preston, placing their hands firmly on their duty belts. "The collateral was rejected due to a highly fraudulent signature," Mr. Sterling stated coldly. "The new creditor owns your entire debt portfolio. They specifically ordered us to freeze all interior assets, including your servers, computers, and paper files. You need to vacate the premises right now, or these gentlemen will physically remove you for criminal trespassing." Preston stood completely frozen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The invincible armor of his wealth and entitlement had been completely stripped away in less than 5 minutes. He was nothing but a broke trespasser standing in a puddle of spilled coffee. The security guards grabbed him by his tailored suit jacket and forcefully marched him back into the elevator. They escorted him out through the crowded main lobby, ensuring every single corporate employee in the building witnessed his absolute humiliating downfall. Exactly 10 miles away in the wealthy enclave of Buckhead, my sister Chloe was busy maintaining her flawless public facade. She was hosting an incredibly lavish mid-morning brunch at the Magnolia Hills Country Club. It was the most exclusive and expensive social club in the entire state. I parked my practical sedan between a row of gleaming luxury vehicles and walked straight toward the outdoor dining terrace. The crisp morning air smelled of expensive floral perfume and freshly cut grass. I could hear Chloe's shrill, affected laughter ringing out across the manicured lawn. She was sitting at the premium center table, surrounded by 6 wealthy high society wives. They were sipping premium mimosas and picking at delicate pastries. Chloe was wearing a pristine white designer sundress and flaunting the massive diamond ring Preston had bought her during their engagement. I did not bother checking in with the hostess. I marched directly onto the terrace, my dark blazer and dark denim jeans standing out sharply against the sea of pastel country club uniforms. The conversation at Chloe's table ground to an immediate awkward halt as I approached. Chloe looked up and her perfectly painted smile instantly hardened into a mask of pure venom. She quickly calculated her social surroundings and decided to go on the immediate offensive. She stood up, adjusting her sparkling gold bracelets to ensure her wealthy friends noticed them. "Maya," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried to the neighboring tables. "Did you get horribly lost? The staff entrance for the kitchen is around the back of the building. And what on earth are you wearing to my club? Did you buy those cheap jeans at a discount rack? You are deeply embarrassing me in front of my important guests. Please leave before I have management escort you out." Several of the wealthy wives covered their mouths, hiding quiet, malicious giggles. They looked at me with open pity and disgust. Chloe stood taller, clearly believing she had completely won the interaction and asserted her absolute dominance. I remained perfectly calm. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I walked right up to her table and dropped the massive stack of legal documents directly onto Chloe's plate of eggs Benedict. The heavy thud rattled the crystal champagne flutes. "Since your husband Preston currently cannot access his downtown penthouse office because it is heavily padlocked with steel chains, I figured I would bring his official bankruptcy and eviction notices directly to you," I announced. My voice was loud, clear, and projected perfectly across the silent terrace. Chloe's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of chalk white. She stared down at the documents, soaking up hollandaise sauce on her plate. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice trembling wildly. "Preston is at his office. We are perfectly fine." "Preston is completely broke," I stated, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "His hedge fund is entirely insolvent. His commercial lease is terminated. His assets are completely frozen. He tried to forge my signature to steal my home, but he failed miserably. I bought his corporate debt, Chloe. I own everything he has. Your perfect billionaire husband is currently being escorted out of his own lobby by armed security guards." The entire country club terrace erupted into shocked and dramatic gasps. The wealthy wives sitting at the table physically recoiled, pulling their chairs away from Chloe as if financial ruin was a highly contagious disease. The ultimate social humiliation crashed down on my sister in front of the exact people she desperately wanted to impress. Her flawless high society life was officially and publicly destroyed. Chloe fled the country club in a cloud of public humiliation, but her panic quickly mutated into pure vindictive rage. She and my mother retreated to the fortified walls of Evelyn's sprawling estate and immediately launched a highly coordinated digital war against me. By dinner time, my social media feeds were completely exploding with targeted notifications. Chloe had uploaded a perfectly lit, expertly edited, tearful video claiming I was undergoing a severe mental health crisis. She stared directly into the camera lens with perfectly applied waterproof mascara, painting a completely fabricated narrative for her thousands of followers. She portrayed me as a bitter, unhinged sister violently jealous of her perfect, successful interracial marriage. She explicitly claimed that I had illegally hacked into Preston's business accounts in a manic attempt to sabotage their happiness. The video was engineered to absolute perfection, hitting every single sympathetic trigger point, and it garnered tens of thousands of views within a matter of hours. Evelyn did not stop at Facebook and Instagram. She aggressively weaponized our lifelong church community against me. Pastor Miller was a man who had known me since childhood and had even officiated my wedding with David. Suddenly, his secretary claimed he was entirely too busy to return my calls. I received passive-aggressive text messages from women who used to invite me to weekly Bible study, telling me they were praying for my troubled soul. When I walked into the local grocery store to buy formula for Leo, women from the congregation would physically turn their shopping carts around in the aisles to avoid making any eye contact with me. My mother had convinced the entire congregation that I was a dangerous, unstable presence who was actively trying to destroy my sister's family out of pure spite. They framed my legal actions regarding Preston's legitimate eviction as a terrifying manic episode rather than a lawful business transaction. I was effectively and brutally excommunicated from the only community I had ever known. While Chloe handled the social assassination, Preston aimed directly for our livelihood. His hedge fund was in ruins, but he still retained powerful connections from his country club golfing days. He reached out to a state senator he had previously funded with heavy campaign donations and leveraged that political weight to directly attack my husband's pristine military career. 2 days after the country club incident, David was abruptly summoned to his commanding officer's office at the naval base. Preston had filed a formal, highly detailed complaint, claiming David had physically cornered him in a dark parking garage and issued explicit death threats against him and his family. Preston fabricated a complete, seamless timeline of relentless harassment. He used the false child abuse hotline call that Chloe and Evelyn had orchestrated as supposed evidence of our toxic, violent household environment. Preston claimed in his official report that David was a volatile military officer completely unhinged by combat trauma, and that I was his willing accomplice in terrorizing civilians. The Navy takes any accusation of civilian violence from its commissioned officers incredibly seriously. David was immediately placed on administrative leave pending a full formal investigation by the military police. His highly anticipated promotion to commander was indefinitely suspended. His top-secret security clearance was officially flagged, preventing him from doing any of his tactical work. Preston was systematically dismantling my husband's entire life simply because I had exposed his massive financial fraud. The pressure inside our household became absolutely suffocating. Without David's active duty pay and with the mounting legal fees required to defend against Preston's false claims, our savings were going to take a massive hit. David remained remarkably stoic, maintaining his rigid military discipline, but I could see the heavy toll the suspension was taking on him. He had dedicated his entire adult life to serving his country with honor, and my toxic family was using his service as collateral damage in their petty war of vanity. I felt a crushing wave of intense guilt for bringing this chaos into our home. I broke down in the kitchen and offered to transfer the commercial deeds back to Evelyn just to make the relentless attacks stop. David flatly refused. He pulled me into a tight embrace and promised we would fight them together until they were completely exposed. We just needed absolute, undeniable proof to completely crush Preston's fabricated narrative and clear David's name once and for all. We spent the entire weekend locked in my home office, poring over the financial documents I had secured from my grandmother's lockbox and the debt portfolios I had legally acquired from the collection agency. My eyes were burning and my head was pounding from staring at the microscopic print of the bank ledgers. We had printed out hundreds of pages of transactional history, pinning them to a corkboard, like detectives trying to solve a homicide. We were searching for any hidden anomaly that could explain exactly how Preston had lost so much money so incredibly fast. Real estate downturns and bad market investments usually take months or even years to drain a corporate portfolio of that massive magnitude. Preston's corporate accounts had bled out entirely in a matter of weeks. The math simply did not make any logical sense. We drank pot after pot of black coffee highlighting strange offshore wire transfers and obscure shell company routing numbers. As I was tracing a particularly strange sequence of massive withdrawals matching the exact dates of Chloe's recent luxury shopping sprees, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly against the wooden desk. The sudden noise made me jump in my chair. I picked up the device and saw a text message from a completely untraceable international number. I opened the message and felt a violent shockwave of pure adrenaline shoot straight through my chest. The glowing screen provided the exact missing puzzle piece we had been desperately searching for. The text read that Preston is not just broke, he has been systematically stealing from his elite corporate clients to pay off massive debts to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. I have the exact digital ledger proving his massive embezzlement. Meet me at the abandoned shipping yard on the south side at exactly midnight. Come alone. The rain began to fall in heavy, unforgiving sheets as I navigated my car toward the decaying industrial shipping yard on the south side of Atlanta. Midnight in this part of the city was a desolate landscape of rusted metal containers and flickering amber streetlights. My heart hammered against my ribs with a relentless primal rhythm. I had explicitly told David to track my location using the encrypted military software on his tablet, ready to dispatch local law enforcement if I stopped moving for more than exactly 3 minutes. I parked my vehicle in the shadow of a massive crumbling crane and turned off the headlights. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against my windshield was the only sound in the suffocating darkness. A slender figure suddenly stepped out from behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets, holding a small flashlight. I kept my hand resting firmly on the heavy steel flashlight in my center console as I slowly rolled down my driver's side window. The pale, trembling face illuminated by the harsh white beam belonged to Julian. He was Preston's notoriously overworked and chronically verbally abused executive assistant. Julian looked absolutely terrified, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if he expected a team of corporate assassins to emerge from the rain. He practically shoved his freezing hands through my open window. His knuckles were bruised, and his expensive tailored suit was soaked completely through. He dropped a sleek black encrypted flash drive directly onto my lap. Julian did not waste time with pleasantries or formal greetings. He explained in a rapid, breathless whisper that Preston had severely crossed a line that afternoon. Following the public eviction at the corporate tower, Preston had returned to their temporary satellite office and violently thrown a heavy crystal decanter at Julian's head. The glass had shattered against the wall, barely missing his skull. Julian decided in that exact terrifying moment that he was entirely done protecting a narcissistic criminal who treated his loyal staff like disposable garbage. Preston is not just dealing with bad market fluctuations, Julian stammered, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes. He is heavily involved with a brutal offshore gambling syndicate operating out of Macau. He lost $8 million betting on illegal high-stakes international sports fixtures. When the syndicate threatened to break his legs, he panicked. He started quietly liquidating his wealthiest clients, conservative portfolios, and wiring the stolen funds through a complex web of untraceable shell companies. I downloaded his master ledger from his private secure server right before the building manager locked us out. You need to take this to the federal authorities immediately before he manages to flee the country. I thanked Julian and promised him absolute anonymity before throwing my car into reverse and speeding back toward the safety of my heavily fortified neighborhood. David was pacing the hardwood floor of our kitchen when I walked through the front door. He immediately took the damp flash drive from my shaking hands and booted up his secured military-grade laptop. He bypassed the basic password protections Julian had warned us about and opened the massive encrypted spreadsheet. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen with rows upon rows of devastating financial data. The sheer scale of Preston's sociopathic greed was staggering to witness in real time. We spent the next hour cross-referencing the offshore routing numbers with the drained client accounts. Preston had systematically targeted his oldest and most trusting investors. He preyed specifically on elderly widows and retired corporate executives who rarely checked their daily financial statements. He funneled their life savings into fake holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands and then transferred the laundered cash directly to the Macau gambling syndicate. My husband traced the digital footprints with cold, tactical precision, mapping out a textbook federal wire fraud case that would easily carry a mandatory 20-year federal prison sentence. Preston was not just a terrible businessman. He was a highly dangerous cornered animal facing imminent catastrophic ruin. I scrolled down to the bottom of the master ledger to review the most recent batch of liquidated assets. My finger completely froze on the trackpad. A cold wave of absolute horror washed over my entire body, paralyzing my lungs. I blinked hard, praying my exhausted eyes were playing a cruel trick on me, but the digital text remained unchanged. Right there on line 412 were the names Marcus and Evelyn Thorne. Preston had not just targeted anonymous wealthy strangers, he had entirely drained my parents' private joint retirement fund. The account that held the massive sum of $3 million they had accumulated over 40 years of business was completely zeroed out. My father and mother were entirely destitute, and they had absolutely no idea. Preston had stolen every single dime they owned to cover his illegal gambling debts, leaving them with nothing but their arrogant country club vanity. I was just opening my mouth to tell David the sickening truth when my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so David could hear. Marcus did not bother saying hello. His booming voice echoed from the speaker, dripping with toxic condescension. "You have finally pushed me too far, Maya," he barked. "I know all about your pathetic stunt at her brunch today. You think you are so clever faking those eviction notices. I am demanding that you drop this ridiculous vendetta right now before I hire a legal team to destroy your life. You are a bitter, jealous disappointment. Preston is a financial genius who will multiply our wealth tenfold. In fact, I went to the bank an hour ago. I transferred $500,000 in cash directly into his account to help him bypass your fake freeze. I did it to teach you a lesson." The line went completely dead. He just gave everything to a scammer. The dial tone echoed through the silent kitchen like a death knell. David closed his laptop with a sharp snap and looked at me. His military training instantly took over the shock of the moment. Marcus had just handed $500,000 of liquid cash to a man who was actively funding a Macau crime syndicate. There was no saving my parents from their own colossal vanity. They were financially bleeding out and fiercely defending the leech attached to their necks. My initial instinct was to call the authorities immediately and hand over the flash drive Julian had risked his life to steal. David stopped me. He pointed out that Preston was a slippery, connected con artist who had already weaponized the military against us. We needed him backed into a corner so tight he would legally hang himself. We needed a confession on the record. We needed him to commit a federal crime right in front of a registered officer of the court. The next morning, I sat in the pristine glass-walled office of Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was a ruthless corporate litigator who despised white-collar criminals. I handed him the encrypted flash drive and explained the entire situation, including the fake Navy complaint threatening my husband's career. Jonathan listened quietly, his sharp eyes calculating every single angle. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled a predatory smile. He told me that presenting forged financial documents during a formal legal settlement was a direct violation of federal law. If we could get Preston to willingly hand over his fake portfolio, we could bypass local jurisdictions and hand him directly to federal prosecutors. The trap was incredibly simple. I just had to swallow my pride and play the absolute victim. I drafted a carefully worded email to Marcus, Evelyn, Chloe, and Preston. I poured every ounce of fake desperation I could muster into the text. I claimed that the Navy investigation was destroying David's mental health and that we were completely out of options. I offered them exactly what they had wanted from the very beginning. I promised to sign over the deed to our house and transfer my grandmother's commercial properties back to the family trust. I only asked that they drop the military complaint in return. Their insatiable greed blinded them to the obvious ambush. They agreed to meet at Jonathan's downtown office at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. I arrived early and sat perfectly still at the massive oak conference table. Jonathan sat beside me, organizing a stack of decoy contracts. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. My family marched into the room like conquering royalty. Marcus and Evelyn wore matching expressions of smug triumph. Chloe strutted in carrying a brand new designer bag, undoubtedly purchased with the stolen retirement funds. Preston brought up the rear, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery, completely unaware that his entire life was about to disintegrate. They did not bother greeting me. Marcus dropped heavily into a leather chair and crossed his arms. "Let us make this quick, Maya," he barked. "I have an afternoon tea time at the club. I warned you that fighting Preston would destroy you. Now your husband is facing a court-martial, and you are crawling back to us begging for mercy. Just sign the properties over and we will call off the military dogs." I kept my head lowered, maintaining the illusion of total defeat. I pushed the polished house deed across the center of the table. I told them I was ready to surrender everything. I kept my voice intentionally quiet and shaking. I explained that my lawyer only had one standard requirement before finalizing the asset transfer. Because I was handing over generational wealth, Jonathan needed basic proof of Preston's financial solvency for the official state records. It was framed as a minor bureaucratic formality. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She leaned across the table and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You are sitting here losing your home and your husband's career, and you still have the audacity to question my husband's success. You are so pathetic, Maya. You are just a bitter, jealous woman who cannot handle the fact that I married a billionaire while you married a disgraced sailor." Preston placed a comforting hand on Chloe's shoulder, playing the role of the magnanimous victor. "It is fine, sweetheart," he said smoothly. "If Maya needs to see my success to finally accept her own failure, I am more than happy to oblige." He unlatched his imported leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, glossy folder embossed with his hedge fund's logo. He tossed it onto the center of the oak table with a loud, arrogant slap. He leaned back and steepled his fingers, looking down his nose at me. "Go ahead and review it." Preston boasted, his chest puffed out with sheer unearned confidence. "You will find certified bank statements, asset declarations, and active investment portfolios. See, I am worth $20 million. You are just a bitter broke girl who tried to play in the major leagues and got completely crushed." I did not say a word. I simply watched as Jonathan Hayes calmly picked up the glossy folder. The room was dead silent as the elite litigator flipped through the crisp pages. He carefully examined the bank logos, the routing numbers, and the official certified stamps Preston had meticulously forged. Jonathan then reached beneath the conference table and pulled out the encrypted flash drive Julian had given me. He set it gently on top of the fake portfolio. Jonathan looked up, adjusting his glasses. He did not look at my parents or Chloe. He locked eyes directly with Preston. "These are excellent forgeries, Preston," Jonathan stated, his voice echoing with cold, legal authority. "Unfortunately, submitting forged financials across state lines during a legal dispute constitutes federal wire fraud." The heavy silence following Jonathan's declaration suffocated the conference room. Preston's arrogant smirk dissolved instantly, replaced by a chalky, sickly pallor. His eyes darted toward the heavy double doors, as if calculating the precise distance for a desperate physical escape. Marcus and Evelyn sat completely frozen, their faces displaying a rare mixture of absolute confusion and dawning terror. My father opened his mouth to issue another commanding threat, but no sound materialized. Preston violently slammed his hands against the polished oak table, rattling the crystal water glasses. The initial shock vibrating through his body rapidly mutated into a cornered, feral rage. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and aggressively yanked out his smartphone. His fingers were trembling so violently he fumbled with the screen before shoving the device directly into my face. He swiped through a series of incredibly disturbing high-resolution images. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I stared at the illuminated screen. The photographs clearly depicted David in his full Navy uniform, committing horrific acts of violence against unarmed civilians in what appeared to be a foreign combat zone. The lighting, the shadows, and the facial expressions were terrifyingly realistic. I knew immediately they were deep fake images generated by advanced artificial intelligence. But to an untrained military tribunal, they would look like undeniable proof of severe war crimes. Preston leaned across the table, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. He lowered his voice into a vicious guttural whisper. "You think you are the only one who knows how to play dirty, Maya?" he spat. "I paid a highly specialized tech firm in Eastern Europe $50,000 to manufacture this entire digital portfolio. I have a scheduled email set to automatically blast these images to every single commanding officer at David's naval base, the Pentagon, and every major national news outlet in the country. Your husband's pristine military career will be utterly obliterated before the sun goes down. He will spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a federal military prison." Preston snatched the phone back and pointed a shaking finger at my chest. He demanded that I immediately transfer the complete ownership of my educational technology company into his name. He did not just want my grandmother's commercial real estate anymore. He knew my software company generated millions in clean annual revenue, and he desperately needed that exact cash flow to satisfy the Macau gambling syndicate. He promised to delete the fabricated photos forever, the exact second I signed over all my voting shares and corporate banking access. My mother finally gasped, pressing her trembling hands against her cheeks, but she did not say a single word to stop him. Marcus simply stared at the table, prioritizing his own financial salvation over my husband's freedom. I looked directly into Preston's bloodshot, panicked eyes and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity. I did not flinch or reach for a pen to sign his extortion demands. Instead, I simply shifted my gaze toward the heavy mahogany door located at the far end of Jonathan's office. The brass handle turned slowly with a sharp mechanical click. David stepped into the room. He was dressed in his immaculate dress blue uniform, his posture radiating an intimidating aura of absolute tactical discipline. He did not yell or display a single ounce of emotional distress. His facial expression was carved from solid granite. He walked with measured, deliberate strides toward the conference table, completely ignoring the panicked gasps escaping my mother's throat. Preston instinctively took a step backward, his false bravado immediately shattering in the physical presence of my husband. David stopped directly across from Preston and calmly placed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table, right next to the encrypted flash drive. He looked at Preston with the cold, detached efficiency of a soldier analyzing a neutralized threat. "You fundamentally misunderstood who you were dealing with." "Preston." David stated, his voice resonating with quiet, terrifying authority. "I informed the Judge Advocate General about your escalating extortion attempts exactly 3 days ago. My commanding officers are already fully aware of the fabricated domestic violence reports you filed. They know about the deep fake imagery you just threatened to distribute. We traced the offshore wire transfers you used to pay the Eastern European tech firm. You used the exact same laundered funds you stole from my wife's parents to purchase those fake photographs." David slowly rested his hands on the back of my leather chair, projecting an impenetrable wall of protection. "I am a highly decorated military officer handling classified national security logistics." David continued, his tone remaining dangerously calm. "When you attempt to blackmail a commissioned officer using fabricated digital evidence, it automatically triggers a massive federal response. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service immediately partnered with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to monitor this specific situation. They have been listening to every single word spoken in this room since you walked through those doors." Preston physically stumbled backward, bumping hard into the edge of a heavy bookshelf. He looked wildly at the ceiling corners, searching desperately for hidden microphones or cameras. Just as the horrific reality of the federal sting operation crushed Preston's remaining defenses, the main conference room doors slammed violently open. Chloe burst back into the room, entirely unhinged after storming out minutes earlier. Her designer mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streams. She pointed a manicured finger directly at David. "I do not care about your stupid military rules," she shrieked hysterically. "I will go to the military police right now and testify you violently assaulted me in the parking lot. I will fake the bruises myself and swear under oath that you attacked me just to put you away forever." Chloe stood panting, completely oblivious to the deafening silence in the room. She did not realize she had just proudly confessed to premeditated perjury and filing false police reports on a live federal wire. The crushing weight of that recorded confession hung in the frigid air of the conference room before the sheer reality of the situation finally penetrated my father's arrogant skull. Marcus slumped into his leather chair, clutching his chest as the monumental consequences of his blind loyalty began to materialize. David did not break his rigid military posture or offer a syllable of comfort. He picked up his manila folder, locked eyes with a hyperventilating Preston, and informed them that federal agents would be arriving at their respective residences within the week. We turned our backs on my shattered toxic family and walked out of the glass doors without looking back. You would assume that staring down multiple federal indictments would force my parents into profound hiding. But narcissism is an incurable disease. Marcus was incapable of accepting his immediate public downfall. He chose absolute denial. 3 days after that disastrous legal meeting, the annual Black Excellence Business Gala took over the grand ballroom of the downtown Ritz-Carlton. It was the most prestigious corporate event of the entire year, designed specifically to celebrate elite entrepreneurs and industry titans. Marcus had spent months heavily lobbying the selection committee to secure the highly coveted Lifetime Achievement Award. He viewed this specific night as his ultimate coronation, and he was not going to let a pending federal wire fraud investigation ruin his moment in the spotlight. According to the furious text messages I had received from a few sympathetic cousins, my father was stubbornly pushing forward with his grand master plan. He intended to use his acceptance speech to officially announce Preston as the sole successor to his entire commercial real estate empire. He was desperately trying to project an illusion of bulletproof stability, hoping that a massive public display of generational wealth would magically intimidate the federal prosecutors into dropping their case. It was a pathetic final grasp at power from a man who was already financially drowning. The hotel entrance was completely swarming with local news anchors, aggressive paparazzi, and high society photographers. Brilliant flashes of light illuminated the damp pavement as luxury vehicles continuously pulled up to the velvet ropes. When our hired black car finally rolled to a smooth stop at the edge of the red carpet, a sudden noticeable hush fell over the clustered media professionals. David stepped out of the vehicle first, looking absolutely breathtaking in his pristine navy dress blues. The Judge Advocate General had immediately reinstated his rank and fully cleared his immaculate record the second they reviewed the audio of Chloe's unhinged confession. He extended his white-gloved hand to me, and I stepped into the blinding explosion of camera flashes. I was wearing a jaw-dropping $20,000 custom emerald gown that flowed around me like liquid glass. My educational technology company had just closed a massive partnership deal with a national school district, and I decided it was time to stop hiding my self-made wealth. We moved down the carpet with absolute effortless grace. Reporters aggressively shoved microphones in our direction, shouting questions about my recent corporate acquisitions and asking David about his upcoming promotion to commander. We were a portrait of undeniable power and unbothered success, entirely eclipsing the tired, aging narrative my parents had spent decades trying to sell. As we approached the ornate golden doors leading into the main VIP reception area, a shrill, familiar voice shattered the elegant atmosphere. Evelyn pushed her way through a group of startled cocktail waiters, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She was wearing an outdated, heavily sequined dress that looked incredibly desperate compared to the modern, sleek tailoring of the other guests. She planted herself directly in the center of the doorway and threw her arms out wide, physically blocking our path to the ballroom. Her eyes darted around frantically, making sure none of her country club friends were watching her lose her composure. "You have absolutely no right to be here tonight," she hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic venom. "This is your father's special evening, and you are not going to ruin it with your pathetic jealousy. Turn around and go back to your miserable little life, Maya, because you do not belong in this room." David gently placed his hand on the small of my back, a silent, steady anchor against my mother's hostility. I did not raise my voice or break my calm smile. I stared at the woman who spent my existence making me feel like a worthless burden. Before I could formulate a proper response, the lead event organizer stepped out from behind a tall floral arrangement. He was a distinguished man, wearing a tuxedo and holding a digital guest ledger. He looked at my mother with extreme professional exhaustion and deep personal disgust. He smoothly stepped between us and gestured toward the open ballroom doors. "Excuse me, madam," he said, his voice projecting clearly enough for the surrounding guests to hear every word. "You are creating a fire hazard by blocking the entrance, and you are currently harassing our most important guest. I need you to step aside immediately." Evelyn scoffed, tossing her head back with incredible arrogance. "You have no idea who I am," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "I am the wife of the man receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award tonight. She is just my ungrateful, estranged daughter who crashed this event." The organizer did not blink. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his screen. "I know exactly who your husband is, madam, and his award does not grant you the authority to dictate our guest list." He turned his attention back to me and offered a deep bow. "Please accept my profound apologies for this disruption, Maya. We are honored to have you here tonight." He looked back at Evelyn with a cold finality. "Maya did not crash this event, madam. She is our platinum sponsor for the entire evening." Evelyn's jaw practically unhinged as she stared at the event organizer as if he had just spoken in a demonic tongue. Her heavily powdered face drained of all color, leaving her looking sickly and hollow beneath the harsh venue lighting. I did not offer her a single glance of pity or acknowledgement. I simply laced my arm tightly through David's and walked directly past her rigid, trembling body into the glittering ballroom. The space was a breathtaking display of excessive corporate wealth and high society vanity. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of circular tables draped in heavy black silk and adorned with towering centerpieces of rare white orchids. Because of my platinum sponsorship status, David and I were immediately escorted to the premier center table located directly in front of the main stage. My parents and Preston were relegated to a secondary tier table off to the far side of the room. I could feel their furious, confused glares burning into the back of my neck throughout the entire catered dinner, but I remained entirely focused on the flawless execution of my final strike. When the overhead lights finally dimmed to a soft, dramatic purple, the ballroom grew hushed with anticipation. The master of ceremonies, a local television anchor, stepped up to the crystal podium and began reading a heavily embellished biography of my father. Marcus puffed out his chest, smoothing his expensive silk tie, as the announcer listed a completely fabricated litany of his philanthropic achievements and business milestones. When his name was officially called, Marcus marched up the carpeted stairs with the arrogant swagger of a conquering emperor. The applause from the room of rival chief executive officers, politicians, and venture capitalists was polite but substantial. He gripped the outer edges of the podium and leaned into the microphone, flashing his signature predatory smile to the flashing cameras. He spoke for 10 agonizing minutes about his incredible visionary mindset, his unmatched business acumen, and the supposedly heavy burden of carrying generational wealth. He completely erased my grandmother's foundational hard work and grueling sacrifices, painting himself as the sole architect of the family empire. But the true sickening climax of his speech came when he abruptly pivoted to the future of the company. Marcus gestured grandly toward his side table, demanding that the spotlight swing over to illuminate Preston and Chloe. He proudly announced to the room of elite billionaires that he was officially naming Preston as the sole successor to the Thorne real estate dynasty. He called his son-in-law a financial prodigy, a genius hedge fund manager who possessed the exact ruthless instinct required to elevate their family into the billionaire class. Preston stood up and offered a smug, practiced wave to the applauding crowd, soaking in the unearned adoration, while Chloe beamed with toxic pride. As the applause began to naturally taper off, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. He announced that before presenting the Physical Glass Lifetime Achievement Award, they had a special presentation from the evening's platinum sponsor. Marcus looked momentarily confused, expecting a corporate executive from a major bank to step forward and shake his hand. His confusion rapidly mutated into sheer unadulterated panic when I stood up from the center table and gracefully climbed the stage stairs. Evelyn half stood from her chair in the audience, her face twisted in absolute terror, but she was completely paralyzed by the hundreds of watching eyes. They were trapped in the spotlight, and any public outburst would instantly destroy their carefully curated social facade. I stepped up to the microphone and smiled warmly at the audience. Marcus was trapped, standing just 3 feet away from me, his jaw tight with suppressed, violent rage. I told the crowd I wanted to offer a very special daughter's tribute to honor the true legacy of our family. I spoke about my grandmother and her relentless, grueling work ethic. I explicitly highlighted how she built her commercial real estate portfolio, brick by brick with honesty and absolute transparency. I let my voice resonate through the massive ballroom speakers, emphasizing that true wealth is built on integrity, while fake empires are constructed on theft and fragile vanity. Marcus visibly relaxed, assuming I was simply giving a generic, albeit slightly passive-aggressive family speech. He clearly thought I was trying to save face and publicly align myself with his Lifetime Achievement Award. He had absolutely no idea the guillotine was already dropping. I reached into the hidden pocket of my custom emerald gown and pulled out a small black wireless presentation remote. I told the audience that to truly honor my father's current business legacy, we needed to look at the undeniable, unvarnished numbers. I raised the clicker and pressed the central button. The massive LED screens spanning the entire back wall of the stage instantly switched from a glowing portrait of my father to a glaring white spreadsheet. I did not show them a generic, harmless corporate slide. I projected the exact unredacted financial ledgers Julian had risked his life to steal from Preston's encrypted server. The text was magnified to a massive scale, making the glowing red negative numbers impossible to miss. I pressed the button again, scrolling down to the offshore banking logs. I clearly and calmly explained to the silent, captivated ballroom that the brilliant financial visionary they had just applauded was actually a desperate criminal funding a violent Macau gambling syndicate. Marcus lunged towards the podium, his face purple with absolute fury, attempting to snatch the microphone away from me to stop the presentation. I easily sidestepped his frantic grasp and pressed the clicker a third time. The final document flashed across the massive screens in high definition. It was the joint retirement portfolio belonging to Marcus and Evelyn Thorne, showing a catastrophic balance of absolute zero. I announced into the microphone that Preston had completely embezzled every single dollar of my parents' life savings just 24 hours ago to cover his illegal tracks, and that the Thorne real estate empire was entirely bankrupt. The elite crowd erupted in a deafening chorus of shocked gasps and frantic whispers as the undeniable proof of their utter financial ruin hovered brightly above them. Marcus stared blankly at the projection, his jaw hanging slack as his brain rejected the numerical reality. The collective gasp from the crowded ballroom mutated into a chaotic symphony of whispers and muffled exclamations of sheer disbelief. Rival executives pulled out smartphones, instantly snapping photographs of the catastrophic financial ledgers displayed across the stage. Evelyn let out a strangled wail, realizing her country club existence had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the humiliating truth of absolute financial ruin. Preston did not look at my father or mother. He did not even look at his furious wife. His survival instinct hijacked his manufactured persona. He spun around wildly, his tuxedo jacket whipping through the air, and bolted toward the edge of the stage. He took the carpeted stairs 2 at a time, his leather shoes slipping awkwardly as panic destroyed his coordination. He hit the ballroom floor with a heavy thud and sprinted directly down the central aisle, shoving past a stunned waiter. He thought he had a clear path to the rear exit. He was entirely wrong. David stepped out from the shadows, moving with the fluid grace of a seasoned combat veteran. He planted himself squarely in the center of the main aisle, blocking the only viable escape route in the entire ballroom. David crossed his muscular arms over his broad chest, his pristine navy dress blues creating an impenetrable physical wall of absolute authority. Preston skidded to a violent halt, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with cornered animal terror. He looked up at my husband silently, begging for a physical opening. David did not move a single muscle. He just stared down at the trembling fraud, radiating a silent promise of physical destruction if Preston decided to take even one more step forward. "Move out of my way, you arrogant soldier!" Preston hissed, his voice cracking with desperate hysteria. "You have no jurisdiction here and cannot hold me against my will." David slowly tilted his head, maintaining his imposing, unyielding stance without breaking eye contact. "I do not need military jurisdiction," David replied, his voice a deep rumbling baritone. "I just need to hold you right here for exactly 10 more seconds." Right on cue, the brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned simultaneously. The massive wooden panels burst open with a concussive thud that instantly silenced the room. A team of 12 federal agents marched into the glittering space, moving with tactical precision. They wore dark tactical jackets emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The elite crowd of billionaires, politicians, and venture capitalists scrambled backward, parting like the Red Sea, to give the armed agents a wide path to the front of the room. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing woman with a severe expression, marched straight down the center aisle toward the stage. Two heavily armed agents flanked her closely, resting their hands securely on their utility belts. Preston spun around, looking wildly for a side door, a catering exit, or any dark corner to escape his doom. He took one frantic step left, but David mirrored his movement, trapping him perfectly between a military officer and a squad of federal investigators. There was nowhere left to run. Preston Thorne, the lead agent, announced, her voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a sharpened steel blade. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and numerous severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act." Preston opened his mouth to deploy his slick legal defense, but the words died instantly in his throat. Two agents stepped forward, grabbing his arms and twisting them behind his back. The sharp click of the steel handcuffs echoing loudly through the ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. They patted down his custom suit, extracting his wallet, his forged passport, and the encrypted phone he used to communicate with the Macau syndicate. The arrogant man who had spent years tormenting me and threatening my husband's career was instantly reduced to a pathetic, whimpering mess, crying softly as the cold steel bit deeply into his wrists. Marcus finally collapsed onto the stage stairs, clutching his chest tightly as he watched his hand-picked golden boy being dragged away in federal chains. The coveted Lifetime Achievement Award he had lobbied to receive now felt like a sick, twisted joke, mocking his catastrophic failure. "Wait. Stop right now. Take your hands off my husband." Chloe launched herself out of her velvet chair, kicking off her expensive high heels so she could sprint across the ballroom floor. She charged down the aisle, her heavy designer gown trailing behind her. She was completely manic, refusing to process the terrifying reality unfolding right in front of her. She stopped directly in front of the lead FBI agent, placing her hands aggressively on her hips in a ridiculous display of artificial dominance. "You cannot do this!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Thorne family. We are untouchable. You cannot just storm into a private gala and arrest my husband like a criminal. We are rich. We have the best lawyers in the state. We will sue you and your department into absolute poverty." The lead agent did not flinch. She looked at Chloe with a complex mixture of professional exhaustion and deep clinical pity. She slowly pulled a laminated financial dossier from her tactical jacket and held it up for my furious sister to see clearly. "You are going to need court-appointed public defenders, madam," the FBI agent replied, her voice radiating cold, unfeeling reality. "We executed a simultaneous federal seizure warrant exactly 5 minutes ago. Your offshore trusts, your real estate holding companies, and all of your domestic banking accounts have been completely frozen and seized by the federal government. You currently have a balance of negative $2 million. The number echoed in the cavernous ballroom like a physical blow. Chloe physically recoiled as if the federal agent had struck her across the face. The manic energy fueling her aggressive outburst instantly evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of sheer terror. She looked wildly at the surrounding crowd of elites, searching for a single sympathetic face among her wealthy peers. There was none. The venture capitalists and society wives were already stepping backward, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits away from her, as if bankruptcy were a highly contagious disease. David gently placed his hand on my lower back, guiding me away from the chaotic spectacle. We walked out of the Ritz-Carlton, with our heads held high, leaving my toxic family to drown in the shallow grave they had dug for themselves. The spectacular collapse of the Golden Child accelerated with blinding speed the very next morning. Chloe woke up alone in her sprawling suburban mansion, the harsh daylight offering no escape from her new reality. Her phone battery had died after hours of frantically dialing high-priced defense attorneys who all conveniently refused to take her calls. She was pacing the imported hardwood floors of her foyer when the heavy rumble of diesel engines rattled her front windows. Chloe threw open her custom mahogany double doors and was met with the ultimate suburban nightmare. Two massive commercial tow trucks were backing aggressively into her pristine circular driveway. She sprinted outside wearing nothing but a silk designer robe and blindly waved her arms at the repo men. They completely ignored her hysterical demands to stop. One burly man in a neon safety vest calmly attached thick metal chains to the axle of her custom matte black Range Rover. The other operator was already hoisting Preston's imported Italian sports car onto a flatbed trailer. Chloe screamed that there had been a banking error, demanding they unhook her vehicles immediately. She threatened to have them all fired and sued for trespassing. The lead operator simply handed her a thick stack of federal seizure warrants and continued tightening the winch. The true humiliation arrived moments later. The loud mechanical grinding of the tow trucks had drawn the immediate attention of her exclusive neighbors. The wealthy country club wives Chloe had spent years desperately trying to impress were now standing at the edge of their manicured lawns watching her public destruction. They whispered behind their hands, tightly gripping the leashes of their purebred dogs. No one offered to help. No one even looked her in the eye. Chloe stood shivering in her driveway, completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of public disgrace as her primary symbols of unearned superiority were hauled away down the street. Desperation drove her to seek her ultimate safety net. Her credit cards were universally declined when she tried to order a luxury car service, forcing her to scrounge through her designer purses for loose cash just to pay a local cab driver. She directed the taxi to Marcus and Evelyn's sprawling estate, fully expecting her parents to instantly resolve her nightmare. She practically tore the taxi door off its hinges and sprinted up the familiar stone walkway, ready to demand an immediate infusion of cash to hire a ruthless legal team. She found the heavy front gates chained open and the estate swarming with men in cheap suits carrying clipboards. Evelyn was sitting on a stone bench near the empty decorative fountain, sobbing hysterically into her hands. Marcus stood completely motionless on the front porch, staring blankly at a bright red foreclosure notice taped directly to the front door. Chloe demanded to know what was happening, shrieking that she needed money right now. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at his favorite child. He seemed to have aged 2 decades overnight, his skin sallow and his posture utterly defeated. He explained in a hollow, defeated monotone that Preston had not just drained their liquid cash. He had secretly leveraged the entire estate using forged signatures and emptied every single offshore emergency fund. They had absolutely nothing left. The banks were seizing the property, and they had exactly 4 hours to vacate the premises. The crushing reality of their absolute poverty finally stripped away Evelyn's profound arrogance. Panic replaced her lifelong vanity. In a state of total desperation, she realized there was only one person left in their entire bloodline who possessed the financial resources to save them. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, her eyes wide and manic. She reminded him that my educational technology company was booming. I had just sponsored a massive corporate gala and lived in a beautiful, secure home. She convinced him that despite the horrific abuse they had subjected me to, I was still their daughter. She foolishly believed that familial obligation would automatically override a lifetime of calculated cruelty. Late that afternoon, a heavy rain began to fall, washing the last traces of suburban perfection down the street gutters. David and I were sitting quietly in our living room when the doorbell chimed. I walked to the entryway and pulled open the front door. Marcus and Evelyn stood shivering on my covered porch, holding two small, hastily packed suitcases. They looked utterly pathetic, stripped of their expensive accessories and towering egos. The smug conquerors from Jonathan's law office were gone, replaced by two broken, desperate strangers. Evelyn immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears, reaching her shaking hands out toward me. She begged for my forgiveness, claiming they had been completely manipulated and blinded by Preston's lies. She sobbed that the federal agents had locked them out of their own home, and they had nowhere else to go. Marcus swallowed his massive pride and actually bowed his head, asking his estranged daughter for mercy. He pleaded for me to let them stay in our guest wing just until they could get back on their feet and hire a competent lawyer. They expected me to crumble to welcome them inside with open arms and play the role of the dutiful, forgiving child. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, blocking their entry. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world and felt absolutely zero pity. My voice was quiet, steady, and cold as ice. "You called CPS on my baby." I stated my words, cutting through the sound of the falling rain. "You told me I was overreacting. You chose the white scammer over your own black daughter. You do not get to live in my house." I stepped back and firmly shut the door in their faces. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut with a satisfying finality echoing through the quiet foyer of my home. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of Evelyn weeping on my porch, before David gently led me into the kitchen for a cup of tea. We assumed the worst was over, and that my bankrupt family would simply fade into the miserable obscurity they deserved. We drastically underestimated the sheer delusion of a narcissist backed into a corner. 3 weeks later, a process server knocked on my front door, handing me a thick manila envelope containing a civil lawsuit. Chloe was officially suing me for $10 million, citing severe emotional distress and claiming direct ownership of half my educational technology fortune. Her legal filing was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. She explicitly claimed that her elite private school experiences and her constant childhood tutoring of me had directly inspired the core learning algorithms of my software. She argued that without her superior intellectual influence, my company would never have existed. The sheer audacity of her demanding my hard-earned wealth while her federal criminal husband sat in a detention center was staggering but completely on brand for my sister. She had hired a predatory contingency lawyer who specialized in shaking down wealthy tech founders, hoping I would offer a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement just to avoid terrible public press. She wanted to drain my accounts to pay for Preston's federal defense team and fund her eventual return to high society. I immediately called my corporate legal counsel, instructing them not to offer a single penny in settlement. We were taking my desperate sister to court. The downtown civil courthouse was a stark contrast to the glittering ballrooms my sister usually frequented. I arrived early with David and my lead attorney Julian, a ruthless litigator who had helped me secure my initial patents. Chloe strutted into the courtroom 20 minutes late, wearing a modest beige designer dress, clearly selected to project innocent vulnerability. Her predatory lawyer trailed behind her carrying a single leather briefcase. When the proceeding began, Chloe immediately took the stand and initiated the performance of a lifetime. She weaponized her proximity to Preston's elite white heritage, projecting the exact image of a delicate, wronged woman victimized by an aggressively vengeful adopted black sister. She produced practiced white woman adjacent tears, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she spun a horrifying tale of my supposed lifelong jealousy. She told the stoic judge that I had ruthlessly stolen her intellectual property to build my software empire, and then sadistically orchestrated her husband's public arrest out of pure spite. She painted herself as a dedicated, loving sister who had merely tried to guide my chaotic life, only to be rewarded with financial ruin and severe emotional trauma. She sobbed softly, claiming my software was legally her intellectual property, and that my refusal to share the profits had left her destitute and deeply traumatized. The judge, a stern man with silver hair, listened patiently, taking careful notes, while Chloe continued her tearful monologue about family loyalty and stolen legacies. She looked over at me from the witness stand, her eyes completely dry behind the handkerchief, flashing a brief, triumphant smirk. She honestly believed her fragile victim routine was working flawlessly. Julian stood up from our table, straightening his tailored suit jacket with deliberate, methodical slowness. He approached the podium and calmly asked the judge for permission to submit digital evidence directly contradicting the plaintiff's entire character testimony and claims of emotional distress. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, her smirk vanishing as Julian signaled our paralegal to turn on the courtroom projector. The large screen flickered to life, displaying the crystal-clear hidden nanny camera footage from my living room. The courtroom fell into a dead silence as the high-definition video showed Chloe aggressively marching toward my infant son Leo and viciously slapping his small hand away from a toy. The sharp sound of her striking my baby echoed off the wood-paneled walls, followed immediately by Leo's terrified screaming. Chloe gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth as the judge leaned forward, his expression transforming from patient neutrality to absolute disgust. But Julian was not finished dismantling her. He pressed a button on his remote, switching the presentation to a recovered audio file Julian had legally extracted from Preston's seized encrypted server. The recording began playing loudly, filling the silent room with Chloe's unmistakable shrill voice. She was complaining to Preston about her parents demanding to know why Marcus and Evelyn had not transferred more money into their joint accounts. Then her recorded voice clearly stated that she knew Preston was actively siphoning funds from the family real estate portfolio, but she did not care as long as he kept buying her imported luxury vehicles. The audio definitively proved she was a willing, complicit participant in the massive federal embezzlement scheme that ruined our parents. The judge slammed his gavel down with a sharp, violent crack, cutting off Chloe's frantic, desperate attempts to explain the undeniable evidence. He glared down at her from the bench, his voice shaking with suppressed outrage. He declared the lawsuit completely frivolous, throwing the case out immediately and ordering Chloe to pay all of my legal fees in full. The predatory contingency lawyer hastily packed his briefcase, practically running away from his toxic client. Chloe stood alone in the center of the courtroom, stripped of her false victimhood and facing the terrifying reality of her own actions. As David and I turned to leave the courthouse, Chloe lunged forward, grabbing my arm with trembling, desperate fingers. "Maya, please, you have to help me. They are going to indict me as a co-conspirator." I pulled my arm away from her frantic grasp and looked her dead in the eye. "You built this cage, Chloe. Now you get to sit in it while they lock the door." The immediate threat of Chloe's absurd lawsuit had been completely neutralized, but the legal warfare was far from over. My lead attorney, Julian, had immediately filed an aggressive countermotion for severe legal sanctions and punitive damages against my entire family for malicious prosecution and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The judge had demanded an immediate evidentiary hearing the very next morning to determine the exact financial penalties. That meant dragging Evelyn to the witness stand and forcing her to testify under oath about her role in funding and supporting Chloe's fraudulent legal attack. The following day, the courtroom atmosphere was thick with suffocating tension. Evelyn approached the wooden witness box, looking nothing like the formidable society matriarch who had tormented me for 3 decades. Her posture was completely shattered. She wore a dated gray pantsuit, her usually immaculate hair pulled into a frantic, uneven knot. Without her country club wealth and her army of sycophantic friends, she looked incredibly small and fragile. Julian did not offer her a single moment of comfort. He immediately launched into a brutal, methodical interrogation. He presented a comprehensive timeline of my childhood, detailing every instance where Evelyn had deliberately withheld basic emotional and financial support while illegally funneling millions from my grandmother's trust into Chloe's lavish lifestyle. Julian paced in front of the gallery, projecting decades of bank statements and emails onto the large screen. He asked Evelyn point blank why she harbored such venomous, relentless hatred for her own biological daughter. Evelyn tried to deflect, using her standard aristocratic superiority. She lifted her chin and claimed she simply wanted to instill a strong, independent work ethic in me. She argued that giving me money would have spoiled me. Julian countered instantly by projecting my grandmother's original handwritten diary entries. The documents explicitly stated that my grandmother had intended for her massive real estate portfolio to be managed jointly by her descendants to build generational wealth, not to exclusively fund Marcus and Evelyn's shallow vanity projects. Julian leaned directly into the microphone, his voice echoing through the silent room, asking Evelyn why she felt so deeply threatened by my existence. The sheer pressure of public ruin and undeniable evidence finally cracked her fragile psychological armor. Evelyn gripped the edges of the witness stand, her knuckles turning stark white. She did not look at the judge or her defense lawyer. Her bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. Her voice started as a trembling whisper before rapidly escalating into a raw, hysterical scream. She confessed that looking at me every day was exactly like looking at a ghost. I possessed the exact same relentless grinding work ethic as her own mother. Evelyn admitted in front of the entire courtroom that she absolutely despised her mother. My grandmother had built her commercial real estate empire with calloused hands, gruff negotiations, and dirt under her fingernails. Evelyn had spent her entire adult life desperately trying to erase those blue-collar roots to seamlessly blend into the elite, untouchable echelons of high society. She had married Marcus purely for his established pedigree. But I was the undeniable living proof of exactly where they came from. I was gritty, determined, and utterly unimpressed by superficial luxury. Every time I succeeded through sheer willpower, I reminded Evelyn that her entire aristocratic persona was a fragile, carefully constructed lie. She hated me because I was authentic and she was completely fake. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, I felt a profound physical shift occur inside my chest. For over 30 years, I had carried a suffocating anchor of guilt, constantly wondering what I had done wrong to deserve such relentless cruelty from the woman who gave birth to me. I had agonizingly analyzed every childhood memory, searching for the exact moment I had failed to be a good enough daughter. Hearing Evelyn's hysterical, unhinged confession instantly shattered that lifelong illusion. The abuse was never about my inadequacies or my failures. It was entirely about her deeply rooted self-hatred and toxic, desperate classism. I looked at the weeping, broken woman on the witness stand and felt absolutely nothing. The deep-seated anger, the desperate craving for maternal validation, the lingering bitterness, it all evaporated into thin air. I was completely emotionally detached. She was no longer my mother. She was simply a tragic, bankrupt stranger who had poisoned her own life with greed and vanity. I reached over and gently squeezed David's hand, signaling that I was finally unequivocally free from their toxic gravitational pull. The judge struck his wooden gavel with a sharp, violent crack, silencing Evelyn's pathetic sobbing. His face was a mask of sheer judicial disgust. He addressed the courtroom, stating he had rarely witnessed such a malicious, coordinated abuse of the legal system by a single family. He formally granted Julian's counter-motion in its entirety. The judge ordered Chloe and Evelyn to immediately pay $2.5 million to cover my extensive legal fees and punitive damages. Chloe let out a strangled, horrified gasp from the back of the gallery. She practically threw herself over the wooden partition, whining to the judge that her accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government and she did not have a single dollar to her name. She claimed the massive financial penalty was impossible to fulfill and begged for leniency, wiping away fresh tears. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at my sister with absolute zero sympathy. He informed Chloe that since she lacked the financial liquidity to pay the court-ordered damages, she would satisfy her massive debt to society through a mandatory public service mandate. He did not assign her to a quiet, comfortable desk job at a local charity. He ordered her to perform 5,000 hours of intensive manual labor with the city sanitation department. He explicitly assigned her to pick up trash on the exact downtown streets where I had once worked 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to survive. The poetic justice of my sister wearing a fluorescent orange safety vest while scrubbing discarded chewing gum off the burning Atlanta pavement was undeniably satisfying, but my ultimate focus had already shifted toward a much grander vision. With Chloe publicly humiliated and my parents entirely banished from my peaceful existence, I was finally free to resurrect the true, authentic legacy of the Thorne family. Julian moved with lethal corporate efficiency to secure the foundational asset my grandmother had originally built with her bare hands. Because Preston had illegally leveraged the commercial real estate portfolio to fund his massive gambling syndicate, the bank had seized the original downtown Atlanta property. I did not ask for favors or negotiate a tedious payment plan with the federal receivership. I simply wired the exact unredacted balance in full, purchasing the entire sprawling complex outright in a closed municipal auction. Walking through the abandoned, dusty corridors of my grandmother's original headquarters, I felt a profound spiritual connection that brought tears to my eyes. The peeling floral wallpaper and cracked linoleum floors held the lingering ghosts of her relentless, unyielding ambition. Evelyn had desperately tried to erase this place, selling it off piece by piece to fund her ridiculous country club facade and maintain her proximity to elite white wealth. I was going to transform it into a towering monument of Black excellence that would outlast all of their superficial vanity. Over the next 14 months, I poured millions of dollars from my educational technology fortune into a complete structural and technological resurrection of the estate. I did not want a simple aesthetic facelift to appease local politicians. I hired the premier Black architectural firm in Georgia to strip the massive brick building down to its steel bones and rebuild it as a state-of-the-art sanctuary. We installed high-speed fiber optic networks, fully equipped robotics laboratories, and massive collaborative coding spaces designed to rival the best campuses in Silicon Valley. We built a professional recording studio, a culinary arts kitchen, and a dedicated mental health clinic. I brought in top-tier educators and psychological professionals, designing a comprehensive free curriculum that mirrored the exact learning algorithms that had made my software universally successful. The primary goal was to provide underprivileged Black youth in Atlanta with the exact elite educational resources my parents had intentionally hoarded for Chloe and Preston. We proudly named it the Martha Thorne Innovation Academy, honoring the only person in my bloodline who truly understood the fundamental value of relentless grinding labor. The highly anticipated grand opening was scheduled for a bright, crisp Tuesday morning. It quickly transformed from a modest local community ribbon, cutting into a massive statewide media sensation. News helicopters circled noisily overhead, capturing sweeping aerial footage of the gleaming glass and steel facade that now dominated the historic block. Dozens of local television anchors lined the pristine concrete front steps, setting up their bright camera lights and adjusting their microphones in the morning breeze. The entire street had been heavily barricaded by the city police department to accommodate the overwhelming crowd of supporters, educators, and eager young students pressing against the velvet ropes. David stood proudly by my side, looking impossibly handsome in a tailored charcoal suit, while holding our son Leo, who was happily babbling at the flashing camera lenses. Julian and my entire corporate legal team stood grinning in the front row, soaking in the monumental victory. Even the mayor of Atlanta arrived with a full motorcycle police escort, stepping up to the wooden podium to deliver a passionate televised speech about my unprecedented philanthropic investment in the city. He spoke eloquently about breaking cycles of poverty and building generational community wealth. He officially handed me a polished gold key to the city, declaring me a hometown hero, while the massive crowd erupted into deafening cheers. As the mayor smiled and pinned a ceremonial ribbon to the lapel of my tailored emerald blazer, I casually glanced across the crowded intersection. Standing completely motionless on the opposite sidewalk, pushed back behind a row of metal police barricades, were Marcus and Evelyn. They looked utterly unrecognizable from the arrogant billionaires who had once laughed at my modest wedding. Marcus wore a cheap faded suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame, his shoulders slumped in permanent defeat. Evelyn stood beside him, clutching a worn leather handbag, her hair entirely gray and her posture completely broken. They had been forcefully evicted from their luxury ecosystem and relegated to a tiny rented apartment on the grim outskirts of the city. They were standing in the shadows watching the adopted daughter they had systematically discarded and relentlessly abused being nationally celebrated as a visionary savior. They had spent their entire pathetic lives desperately chasing high society status and destroying their own souls for artificial wealth. Now they were forced to watch me achieve genuine universal reverence by embracing the exact working-class roots they had so violently rejected. The press conference concluded with a final massive eruption of applause as the heavy glass doors of the academy officially slid open for the public. Reporters immediately surged forward, begging for exclusive photographs with the mayor and the new city hero. Seeing the flashing cameras and the sudden blinding media frenzy, Marcus experienced a desperate, pathetic resurgence of his old narcissistic instincts. He saw a fleeting opportunity to publicly attach himself to my monumental success and salvage his destroyed reputation. He stepped off the cracked sidewalk and began quickly marching across the busy intersection, adjusting his cheap wrinkled tie and pasting on his signature predatory smile. He clearly intended to shove his way into the press photographs and falsely claim parental credit for my philanthropic triumph before the cameras stopped rolling. He made it exactly halfway across the hot asphalt before hitting an impenetrable physical wall. David's elite private security detail had been quietly monitoring the perimeter all morning, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate maneuver. A massive security guard in a tailored black suit stepped smoothly into the crosswalk, planting his broad, muscular chest directly in front of my father. Marcus let out an indignant gasp and tried to aggressively sidestep the guard, his fake smile faltering as he pointed frantically toward the flashing cameras and loudly claimed he was the beloved father of the honoree. The guard did not move a single inch. He slowly crossed his thick arms, looking down at Marcus with cold professional indifference. "Invitation only," the guard said. The sheer finality of that moment at the barricades perfectly mirrored the merciless conclusion of Preston's legal nightmare. 2 weeks after the academy opened its doors, the federal hammer dropped on my brother-in-law. The mahogany walls of the United States District Court offered no sanctuary for his privilege. Preston stood before the federal judge completely stripped of his tailored Italian suits and his insufferable country club arrogance. He wore an orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily shackled at his waist. The slick, charismatic venture capitalist who had charmed millions out of naive investors and drained my parents' real estate portfolio was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, broken man facing the harsh reality of a federal sentencing. The judge delivered a scathing reprimand, reading off a list of convictions including wire fraud, massive embezzlement, and severe financial conspiracy. He did not hesitate to hand down a brutal 12-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Preston looked desperately toward the gallery, searching the wooden benches for his family. He expected his powerful father and influential uncles to leverage their political connections to save him. Instead, the rows designated for the defendant's family sat completely empty. The elite white dynasty he belonged to had ruthlessly calculated the immense damage his crimes would inflict on their pristine reputation. They legally disowned him, cutting off his trust funds and issuing a terse public statement condemning his actions. Preston was dragged out of the courtroom, weeping uncontrollably, utterly abandoned by the establishment that had shielded him his entire life. While Preston faced a decade behind bars, my sister was serving her own humiliating life sentence out in the open. The crushing reality of absolute poverty had forced Chloe out of her suburban mansion and directly into the trenches of minimum wage labor. Her mandatory community service hours picking up highway trash had ended, leaving her desperate for basic survival income. Without her husband's stolen wealth or our parents' drained accounts, she had zero marketable skills. She secured a grueling shift working as a waitress at a local diner located just 2 miles from her former neighborhood. Her daily uniform consisted of cheap polyester slacks, a yellow apron, and a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. The physical labor of carrying heavy plates and scrubbing tables destroyed her manicures and triggered deep resentment. But the true torture of her new existence was the clientele. The diner was a popular lunch spot for the exact same wealthy society wives Chloe had spent years trying to impress. Women who used to attend her lavish brunches and drink her expensive champagne now sat in her section demanding endless coffee refills and sending back their salads. Chloe was forced to paste on a submissive smile and serve the people who had happily watched her spectacular downfall. They whispered loudly behind their menus, leaving her pathetic single-dollar tips to emphasize her fall from grace. She would hide in the cramped break room during her shifts, sobbing into her hands as she washed the smell of frying oil out of her hair. Every time she approached a booth clutching a coffee pot, she had to endure their condescending pity. They would casually ask her how she was adjusting to the real world, while deliberately spilling sugar packets on the wiped tables just to watch her clean it up. Chloe swallowed her pride day after day, trapped by her need to pay rent on her studio apartment. Her identity had been built on projecting an illusion of flawless superiority and unearned wealth. Now she was scraping ketchup off plates while the women she once considered peers laughed at her stained uniform. The breaking point arrived during a chaotic Tuesday lunch rush. A demanding table of 4 affluent women wearing oversized sunglasses and tennis skirts had been running Chloe ragged for an hour. The ringleader, a woman named Beatrice, who had once vied with Chloe for the presidency of the country club charity committee, snapped her manicured fingers to get Chloe's attention. Beatrice loudly complained that her iced tea lacked lemon and that her turkey club was wilted, demanding an immediate replacement. The sheer condescension in her voice finally shattered Chloe's restraint. She slammed the plastic tray down onto the table, causing the water glasses to violently rattle. She snapped back at Beatrice, telling her she was an insufferable snob and refusing to replace the meal. Beatrice gasped in exaggerated horror, demanding to speak to the manager immediately. Chloe crossed her arms, a brief flash of her old arrogance returning as she waited for her supervisor to arrive. She expected a harsh reprimand from the tired older man who usually ran the day shifts. Instead, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen pushed open, and a woman in a crisp suit stepped out into the dining room. Chloe froze, her defensive posture instantly crumbling as she recognized the manager. It was a Black woman named Sarah. Sarah had been one of the first single mothers to receive a business management grant and job placement training through the Martha Thorne Innovation Academy. My community center had funded her education and helped her secure this management position to support her family. Sarah walked calmly over to the dining table, listening patiently to Beatrice's loud complaints about the waitress's unacceptable hostile attitude. Sarah did not raise her voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. She turned to look at Chloe with absolute steady authority. She did not see the former queen of the suburban elite. She only saw a bitter, insubordinate employee failing to do her job. Sarah pulled a clipboard from her side, firmly ordering Chloe to immediately apologize to the paying customers and then report directly to the back office for a severe formal reprimand. Chloe stood paralyzed, staring at the woman whose life had been completely and utterly transformed by my enormous philanthropic wealth, now holding absolute unyielding power over her miserable daily survival. The humiliating rejection at the crosswalk shattered the last illusion Marcus and Evelyn clung to. Stripped of his dignity and publicly denied access to my triumph, my father slowly backed away from the barricade. He walked back to his weeping wife under the harsh glare of the Georgia sun. They retreated into the shadows of the city, completely invisible to the cheering crowds and flashing cameras. Their ultimate punishment was not just losing all their staggering wealth, but the crushing reality of their new permanent existence. The government seized everything, leaving them dependent on a meager Social Security stipend. They were forced to rapidly relocate to the same dilapidated industrial neighborhood they had mercilessly mocked for decades. Their new residence was a cramped, run-down one-bedroom apartment situated directly above a very noisy 24-hour laundromat. The heavily peeling, faded yellow paint on the extremely thin walls and the constant lingering smell of bleach and exhaust fumes served as a daily reminder of their spectacular fall from grace. The sheer contrast between their former sprawling estate and this miserable claustrophobic trap was agonizing. Evelyn no longer had a staff of maids to perfectly arrange her imported silk sheets or serve her expensive morning espresso. She woke up every day on a sagging mattress, listening to the loud rattling of the ancient radiator and the relentless blaring of police sirens outside her single cracked window. The woman who once hosted lavish charity galas in custom designer gowns now spent her afternoons aggressively counting loose change at the local discount grocery store. She was forced to carefully calculate the exact total price of canned soup and generic bread, terrified of overdrawing her heavily monitored bank account. Marcus suffered an equally brutal descent into total irrelevance. The former real estate titan who ruthlessly commanded boardrooms now spent his days sitting on a cheap plastic chair on a rusted fire escape. He aimlessly watched the neighborhood's stray cats dig through the overflowing trash bins in the narrow alleyway below. He had lost his country club memberships, his luxury vehicles, and the sycophantic friends who only valued his proximity to power. They had built their entire marriage and their collective identity on the fragile foundation of manufactured superiority. Now they had absolutely nothing left but each other and the suffocating weight of their shared, profound regret. The absolute isolation eventually eroded their stubborn aristocratic pride. Living in grinding poverty finally forced them to confront the devastating consequences of their lifelong vanity. They had sacrificed their own biological daughter on the altar of high society status, only to end up entirely alone in a crumbling concrete box. During a particularly cold, rainy evening in November, Evelyn broke down completely. Sitting at a scratched laminate dining table, she pulled out a cheap, lined notepad and a plastic pen. She looked at Marcus, her eyes hollow and filled with genuine, terrible remorse. They spent the next 3 hours agonizing over a single piece of paper, pouring out the first honest words they had ever spoken. They crafted a desperate final plea for forgiveness. They wrote about the blinding toxicity of their ambition, admitting that their obsession with social climbing and their desperate need to impress elite strangers had systematically destroyed their own family. They did not ask for a massive financial bailout or a luxurious place to live. They simply begged for a 5-minute phone call. They pleaded for a chance to hear my voice and apologize for the decades of calculated cruelty they had inflicted upon me. They carefully folded the lined paper, slid it into a plain white envelope, and mailed it to my corporate headquarters, hoping that sheer vulnerability might bridge the impossible chasm they had created. The letter arrived on my desk 3 days later, nestled between quarterly financial reports and massive philanthropic proposals. I was sitting in my spacious, sunlit office, reviewing the latest expansion blueprints for the Martha Thorne Innovation Academy. David was across the room, happily building a tall tower out of colorful wooden blocks with Leo. Our son let out a joyful squeal as the blocks tumbled to the imported rug, filling the room with the beautiful sound of untainted, innocent happiness. I picked up the plain white envelope, recognizing Marcus's sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. My heart did not race and my hands did not shake. I smoothly sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener and unfolded the cheap lined paper. I read their desperate apologies, their profound regrets, and their agonizing realization that they had traded my love for an illusion that ultimately left them with nothing. I absorbed every single word of their final emotional plea. 10 years ago, reading this exact letter would have completely shattered my emotional resolve. I would have instantly crumbled, rushing to their rescue and desperately handing over my fortune just to experience a fleeting moment of their parental validation. But I was no longer that traumatized, lonely girl begging for scraps of affection. I looked at the letter and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I finally understood that true forgiveness is an internal healing process that completely frees you from carrying the heavy, toxic burden of anger. I had forgiven them for my own spiritual survival, but forgiveness does not ever equal granting access. Forgiveness does not require me to open the door to the people who intentionally locked me out in the cold. I calmly stood up from my leather executive chair and walked over to the heavy-duty shredder resting in the corner of my office. I fed the lined paper directly into the loud, grinding metal blades, watching without a single ounce of hesitation as their final, desperate apology was instantly reduced to meaningless, worthless confetti. I turned away from the machine and walked back across the warm, sunlit room, sitting down on the soft rug to build a brand new wooden tower with my smiling husband and my beautiful son. The passage of 6 months dissolved the lingering chaos of the trial into the crisp, biting chill of late December. The holiday season arrived, bringing with it a profound sense of reflection and absolute closure. The previous Christmas had been a terrifying battlefield of toxic expectations, calculated humiliations, and desperate survival. This year, the universe had definitively balanced the scales with poetic, unforgiving precision. The stark contrast between the lives of the people who tried to break me and the beautiful reality I had constructed was nothing short of cinematic. In a dingy, brightly lit diner on the edge of town, Chloe was currently experiencing the brutal, grinding reality of the working-class holiday shift. Her feet throbbed agonizingly inside cheap, unsupportive sneakers as she carried heavy plastic trays of greasy food to impatient, demanding customers. The relentless chiming of the kitchen order bell gnawed at her frayed, exhausted nerves. She aggressively wiped sticky spilled syrup off a faux wood table, her once immaculate manicured hands now raw and calloused from harsh industrial sanitizers. The diner was packed with frustrated last-minute shoppers, but nobody offered her a sympathetic glance or a generous holiday tip. She caught her reflection in the smudged mirror behind the pie display, recognizing a hollow, exhausted stranger staring back. The glittering high society holiday galas she once dominated were happening miles away, and she was entirely uninvited, permanently exiled to a life of serving burnt coffee and enduring the condescending pity of women she used to rule. Across the city, Marcus and Evelyn were enduring their own suffocating version of holiday purgatory. Their tiny one-bedroom apartment above the 24-hour laundromat was freezing. The ancient radiator in the corner let out a violent, rhythmic hissing sound that did absolutely nothing to combat the bitter winter draft seeping through the single cracked window pane. There was no towering imported fir tree covered in crystal ornaments. There was no army of private caterers preparing a massive, extravagant feast. They sat directly across from each other at a wobbly, scratched laminate table, eating generic frozen turkey dinners heated in a cheap microwave. The overwhelming silence between them was deafening. They chewed their tasteless artificial food without speaking, completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of their irreversible isolation. They had spent their entire lives treating human beings as disposable stepping stones to achieve elite status. Now, facing the bitter twilight of their lives, they had absolutely no one left to impress and no one left to care if they existed at all. Miles away in a maximum security federal penitentiary, Preston sat alone in a stark concrete cell. The heavy iron door had slammed shut for the evening lockdown, leaving him in absolute freezing isolation. He sat on a thin, scratchy mattress, wrapping a stiff wool blanket tightly around his shoulders to ward off the biting institutional chill. He stared blankly at the gray cinder block wall, eating a lukewarm tray of unidentifiable prison food. There were no holiday visitation requests submitted for him. His wealthy, powerful family had completely erased his existence from their pristine public records, entirely abandoning him to protect their elite legacy. He was reduced to a simple inmate number, stripped of his arrogance, his stolen wealth, and his fundamental freedom. Miles away from that collective misery, my world was overflowing with radiant, undeniable warmth. David and I had recently purchased a sprawling, gorgeous estate nestled on 20 acres of pristine wooded land. The massive stone hearth in our expansive living room blazed with a roaring fire, casting a beautiful golden glow across the imported hardwood floors. A towering 15-foot spruce tree stood in the grand entryway, decorated not with sterile, expensive designer baubles, but with handmade ornaments, cherished photographs, and memories we had built together as a true family. The house was alive with a vibrant, deafening symphony of pure, unadulterated joy. Our home was packed with over 50 guests, representing the incredible, beautiful community I had carefully cultivated. David's Navy brothers filled the formal dining room, their booming laughter and fierce protective energy, setting a tone of absolute safety and boisterous celebration. The dedicated educators and administrative staff from the Martha Thorne Innovation Academy mingled with my corporate legal team, sharing stories and clinking crystal glasses. Several of the underprivileged scholarship students and their families had been invited as special guests, wide-eyed and smiling as they enjoyed the massive catered feast. The heavy oak dining tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh baked breads, and decadent winter desserts. The air was thick with the rich, comforting scents of cinnamon pine and roasted garlic. It was a gathering of genuine souls who valued loyalty, compassion, and hard work over superficial pedigree. I stood near the grand staircase, wearing a stunning tailored emerald gown, simply absorbing the magnificent scene unfolding in my home. I watched my brilliant husband laughing loudly with his closest friends, his eyes crinkling with genuine, unfiltered happiness. David excused himself from the group and walked over to me, carrying Leo securely against his broad chest. Our son was wearing a tiny velvet holiday suit, giggling wildly as he grabbed at his father's tie. David wrapped his free arm tightly around my waist, pulling me flush against his side. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead, his physical presence grounding me completely. Someone tapped a silver spoon against a crystal flute, calling for a holiday toast. The loud, joyful chatter gradually faded into an expectant, happy silence as every face turned toward the staircase. I reached out and took a glass of sparkling champagne from a passing silver tray. I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, at the diverse, beautiful, chosen family that filled my home with unconditional love. I raised my glass high, the crystal catching the firelight. I did not waste a single breath mentioning the people who had tried to destroy me. I toasted to resilience, to building generational wealth through community, and to the fierce, undeniable power of authentic love. As the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, I leaned my head against David's shoulder, watching the snow begin to fall outside the massive, glowing windows. The ultimate revenge against my abusers was never about seizing their assets or orchestrating their public downfall. The most devastating punishment I could ever inflict upon them was simply moving on. It was building a profoundly beautiful, brilliantly abundant life, entirely without them and never looking back.